Muitos apontam que o Brasil é um país polarizado. De um lado, existem aqueles que, mesmo que em diferentes pontos do espectro político, defendem a democracia como inegociável. Do outro, está a ameaça fascista posta por Jair Bolsonaro. Mas uma questão que paira no ar e raramente recebe a devida atenção é justamente sobre esse termo, o fascismo. Qual o seu significado? A extrema-direita mundial se enquadra no fascismo ou deve ser categorizado como populista? A ameaça bolsonarista é uma ameaça fascista? São essas algumas das questões que eu, Leonardo Sobreira, jornalista do Brasil 247, propus ao historiador e professor argentino Federico Finchelstein, autor de diversos livros sobre fascismo e um dos principais estudiosos do tema no mundo. Entre suas publicações estão Uma Breve História das Mentiras Fascistas, Do Fascismo ao Populismo na História e As Origens Ideológicas da Guerra Suja, sobre a ditadura argentina. Nessa nova série, chamada Conexão 247, os principais intelectuais do mundo entrarão em diálogo sobre os temas mais urgentes do sul global. Nesse episódio, o professor Finchelstein me contou que Bolsonaro, com sua retórica racista, violência e mentiras, não é o típico líder populista e está a um passo de se tornar, oficialmente, um líder fascista. Este último passo seria a instalação de uma ditadura brasileira. No entanto, ele ressaltou: existem formas de frear essa ameaça. Ele afirmou a importância da defesa ativa da democracia brasileira e também defendeu a criação de uma frente ampla antifascista, assim como nos Estados Unidos, para derrotar o Donald Trump. Em seguida, a nossa conversa.
Greetings to all viewers and subscribers of TV 24/7. This is Leonardo Sobreira, and I'm your host for today's Conexão 247. Today, our guest is Professor Federico Finchelstein, who teaches history at the New School for Social Research and Eugene Lang College, both in New York. He's an Argentine scholar with a vast work on fascism and populism, which is what we're going to explore today. Good afternoon, Professor.
It's Good afternoon.
So, Professor, the first thing I wanted to ask you is that the term populist gets thrown around so much these days by the media here, or at least here, the media says that even something like a tax rise is populist. And arguably the same thing happens with fascism. It gets thrown around by the left. And my question is, why do these terms get thrown around so much?
Well, I mean, there is an abuse of these terms, clearly. They are used as an insult rather than a category for political analysis. And once you use them for political analysis in terms of their history, their distinctions, and also their similarities, I think you can gain a better understanding of what's going on.
Right, and that's what you try to do in your book, right? You try to define and grapple with those terms. And you argue that there's a close proximity between populism and fascism. You even say in your book that populism, is some form of authoritarian democracy. And I wanted to ask you exactly what that means, because those are two terms that are not compatible, right?
They are not compatible, but they are part of the same history. And yet they share the similarities, and yet they are very different terms speaking to very different situations. Fascism, as you know, destroys democracy from within in order to create a dictatorship. It does so by applying extremely racist and discriminatory politics to different minorities, people that think, are, or behave differently. And it does so also by lying in extremely totalitarian ways. And of course, by recurring to violence and even militarizing politics to such an extent that there is, incredible amounts of repression and death. So that's fascism. Once fascism is defeated, the fascist powers, Mussolini, Hitler, are defeated after 1945, there are people that were dictators, there are people that were fascists, and realized after 1945 that fascism has become a toxic brand, that you cannot do successful politics in that way. And these people are very known to us because they first emerged in Latin America. And we have famous cases such as, for example, Getúlio Vargas in Brazil or Juan Perón in Argentina, Vargas a dictator, Perón, not only a dictator but also a fascist. I mean, they both, and especially so Perón, they have created dictatorships by coup. Now, what happens is that, in the case of Perón, who is the first to do this, is that he destroys, he does the opposite of what the fascists do. Instead of destroying democracy from within in order to create a dictatorship, he destroys that dictatorship from within to create a democracy. So here we have like a fascist trying to, in a way, leave fascism behind. And I say, there are, of course, authoritarian remnants in what he creates. And yet it's not exactly fascism, because you have an authoritarian leader who is elected. You have an authoritarian leader that, yes, like the fascists, creates a cult of the leader, this kind of charismatic form of government, and so on and so forth, but also leaves behind 4 key elements of fascism. So that's why I say populism is a post-fascism. It's not fascism, but a post-fascism. It's a reformulation of fascism in a democratic key. And the result of that, of course, is an authoritarian form of democracy because it has both democratic elements and authoritarian elements. But let's focus on what populism is not. In other words, what people that were dictators and fascists leave behind. And these are 4 constitutive elements of fascism that they leave behind. They leave behind a totalitarian way of lying. They don't like that way. In a way, they are similar to other types of political traditions. They like communists, socialists, liberals, or conservatives. They lie, but they don't believe in their lies. And even worse than that, because the fascists did that, not only the fascists believe in their lies, but they wanted to transform the world according to those lies. Now, that's element number 1. They leave lies behind. Fascist, totalitarian lies, populists leave behind. Second element, there is not much repression in populism, or at least not much repression if you compare with fascism or other forms of dictatorship. So they leave behind violence, the fascist way of violence, and the militarization of politics. People in uniforms, militias, that kind of stuff they leave behind. You will not see that much in Peronism, Vargism, or, by the way, in any other populism, in my view, from left to right, let's say from Perón and Vargas to Berlusconi or Cristina Kirchner or Chavez or whoever, in 20th century populists, you will not see that. You will not see totalitarian lies to such an extent. You will not see violence and the militarization of politics. Element number 3, you will not see the politics of xenophobia and racism. That is to say, what all German social democrats used to call the socialism of the imbeciles. Not true socialism, but rather trying to cater to the people by spreading racism and lies. So instead of giving equality, they give lies about xenophobic lies about the nation, the superiority of the race, and so on. That's left behind. You will not find that in populism, either right or left. This was not at the center of populist politics in the 20th century because they had left behind that element of fascism, reformulating and adopting democratic elements. So let's remember again, rephrase. Lies, element number 1, that's left behind. Element number 2, violence and the militarization of politics, left behind. Racism, politics of xenophobia, extreme hatred of minorities being at the center of the political, left behind. And then element number 4 of key importance here, dictatorship. That is left behind. All fascists are dictators. You don't need, you can have dictatorship without fascism, but you cannot have fascism without dictatorship. This longing for dictatorship, this glorification of dictatorship, and at the end of the day, this creation of dictatorship by destroying democracy, that is left behind. And of course, I'm sure many of your listeners, if not all of your listeners, then are begging the question, what are we seeing now when we see people like Trump and Bolsonaro returning to these 4 elements? You cannot understand Trump or Bolsonaro or Orban in Hungary or Modi in India and many other people throughout the world, Bukele in El Salvador, and so on, with this return to key elements of fascism. I mean, I ask you, for example, or your listeners, think about this. Can you understand Bolsonaro without this centrality of discrimination, of the politics of hatred and xenophobia? Of course, I don't think you can.
A central aspect, sorry, I just wanted to say that a central aspect of Bolsonaro is exactly something that you have said, which is the militarization of politics. Right here, he's militarized in almost the entirety of the state apparatuses. You have a bunch of ministers who are military men and a bunch of government posts occupied by military men. And you can't help but think that eventually something like a dictatorship is going to develop out of this, right?
So what we are seeing is that, of course, and then let me ask you, what about totalitarian lying and anti-science statements? Even worse, what about trying to ignore empirical evidence in order to transform the world into a lie? And the outcome of that, of course, is not success, but really what's going on, the health crisis that Brazil is living, because this person has been denying reality, trying to create a new reality. But at the end of the day, as also Hitler's demise shows, I mean, there is a reality check. And the people that suffer are not necessarily these leaders, but rather they are victims. In this case, all Brazilians. So basically, if we ask this question, what are we seeing now that this is a populist leader? I mean, it's a person that has been elected in a democracy. Still, the fact that we are having this conversation, I think, shows that we are not yet there. I mean, in a Brazilian dictatorship. I hope we will never be there. And of course, it depends on Brazilians to defend their democracy against these attempts. But the point is that then, out of these four elements, in people like Trump or Bolsonaro, you see for sure three, and there is a big question mark about element number four. Because for sure you see politics of xenophobia and hatred at the center of his politics, in the case of Bolsonaro and also Trump. You see militarization of politics, violence at the center of politics, like the fascists. You see, of course, lies and propaganda at the center of their politics. That's why before Bolsonaro's election, I warned in an article which was then published in Foreign Policy that when, as an expert on fascism, when I saw Bolsonaro's campaign, I couldn't help but think of Goebbels. This is not the typical populist politician. This is not really related to a Vargas or Perón. They behave differently. Yes, they were sometimes authoritarian, but also they will stop at a certain moment. And this person doesn't stop. I mean, of course, they will not even go as we could see this weekend in this kind of, I think, almost cartoonish images of Bolsonaro posing as Jesus, laying on the bed. I just tweeted about this because, of course, this relates to this fascist appropriation of the Christian religion. I mean, all these there are a lot of fascist markers here, but the last element, which, of course, as you know better than I know, Bolsonaro announced that he's thinking that he might not have elections because he's really scared about the possibility of losing those elections, as polls are showing now, and that will be element number 4. I mean, like if and of course I don't think he will, but if he were to succeed in not having elections, then element number 4, dictatorship, will be checked, adding to violence, adding to lies, adding to the politics of hatred. A scholar of fascism such as myself will have to conclude, well, this person is now a fascist.
But so we're just one step away from it, basically.
I think, yes, but I think, it's a big step in the sense that Brazilians can defend their democracy by voting, by being on the streets, by expressing their opinions, defending the independent press, independent journalism, and defending evidence. Because all these type of autocracies, what they want is to replace reality with their myths and with their fictions. So I think there is a danger of fascism here, and certainly in Brazil. In the US, where I live, we had a similar danger with Trump's attempt at a coup d'etat in January 6th, and they keep trying, in terms of doing politics of segregation, promoting lies about vaccination. So this is really a kind of project of, it's I would say, a project of death and destruction, which has the indelible mark of fascist ideology. But they are trying. I mean, the category I'm using is wannabe fascists, people that aspire to be fascists, and sometimes their societies will not allow them. Because as opposed to people that, were, how can I say, conquered by the fascists in countries like the US or Brazil or Italy or Argentina or many other countries, we know what fascism was, how deadly it was, and we know how terrible our dictatorships were in Brazil or Argentina, for example. So we should defend our democracies, basically.
Of course. And Professor, one argument that I struggle with sometimes, but I find it very interesting, is that I've read recently a paper saying that we live in a time perhaps where the basic rules of the game aren't accepted anymore. So the democratic rules of the game might not be accepted by the general population. And the question is, right after that, politics becomes a politics of confrontation rather than a politics of conciliation. And when you have that rearrangement of politics, it's quite hard to think in terms of a democracy in the future. It's growing more likely, according to this paper I've read, the possibility of fascism just becoming the norm because of this. My question is, how do you see this contestation of democratic norms in our society, and what do you attribute this to?
Well, I mean, there are, of course, many reasons, and the reasons are, different on each country. More generally, on every country. More generally, we can say that these leaders were able to, in a way, achieve power through populist means. I mean, they were not doing coup d'etats, but they were, getting votes. And they did so by presenting themselves as a solution to the problems of technocratic expert deciding for the citizens, corruption, and politics as usual, as they will say. And yet, of course, their answer was, vote for this kind of king-like person that knows better than you what you need. I mean, this is the kind of... So my point is that they were presenting themselves as responding to real problems in terms of democracy, but their solutions were extremely anti-democratic ones. So yes, there are problems in our democracies. Many times, for example, in the US Congress, and I will also argue, for example, in the Argentine Congress, you will see that the average representative has much more money than the average citizen. So there are problems of representation here, that you have congresses or senates of billionaires, or people that are not living the typical lives of the citizens, and there you find problems of representation. Now, this issue then is appropriated by people that are not really like the people, so to speak, and yet they want to speak or even impersonate the people. And somebody, there were real problems, let's say, in countries like Argentina, Brazil, India, and these people presented themselves as solving those problems. Of course, once they are in power, we see that they don't solve anything. So there are problems with, criminality or crime in every country, and they present this kind of law and order situation. But then we see when they are in power, actually the violence increases. It doesn't decrease. So, it's a very important question. But, democracy is always something that needs to get better. And when it doesn't, then these authoritarians use that as an excuse to destroy democracy, not to make it better. So I think that is part of the problem. Now, the way to stop this, and I don't want to be pessimistic here, is to realize, because you said something very important, I think, which is, can we talk in a typical political way that with people that are racist, that with people that want to destroy us, to destroy our political system, or that regards us as being, demonic or unfaithful to the Lord, or whatever other anti-democratic idea they have? And the answer is not really, because this is like playing a soccer match with players that want to touch the ball with the hand, and they are not goalkeepers. So the point is that then when that happens, you need to stop them very harshly. And if they need to, to be punished, they should. So, I mean, I think, that is one dimension, right? To really stress issues of justice and constitutional issues. The other part, of course, is that these are not normal times. And in that sense, and I think the US shows an example of that, what you need to fight people that are wannabe fascists, that people that are aspiring to fascism, what the history of fascism shows us is that they have been stopped when you had a coalition of people that do not have the same ideas. In other words, an anti-fascist coalition. And a coalition in which you have people that are on the left, people that are on the center, or even on the right, but they are with the Constitution. That's why sometimes people in Brazil are surprised when I say that from the outside, to me, as a kind of very distant analyst of this, someone like Lula or Fernando Enrique Cardoso, they have much more in common when compared with someone like Bolsonaro, because they represent different politics within the democratic system. Whereas Bolsonaro wants to destroy the democratic system. And I think, again, I might be naive, I might be asking for too much, but this is what happened in the US, when there was a coalition of Democrats on the left, on the center, and even Republicans against the danger of fascism represented by Trump. And this is what Brazil needs, an anti-fascist coalition, in my view, in my humble view.
Professor, you have spoken in your previous answer as well about the relation between fascism and Christianity. And I know you've written about that relation in the case of Argentina. In Brazil, we have a phenomenon with the evangelicals, this branch of faith that is one of the main support bases for Bolsonaro. How do you see the interplay in the case of Brazil, and or perhaps more generally, the interplay of faith with this type of politics?
Well, I mean, fascists and wannabe fascists are very much tempted to somehow relate themselves or even equate themselves with the divine. In this case of Bolsonaro, we have seen him laying on this bed, comparing himself to Jesus, and even saying that it was the God's will if he was going to be out. And then he added, Brazil belongs to us. I mean, and these are extremely, I would say, in terms of Christianity itself, these are, very sacrilegious statements, very profane statements. I mean, this is a guy that claims to be a sort of prophet, that he has a kind of personal connection with God. And that is something that only prophets do. I mean, and if you think in terms of the history, of Christianity or other religions such as Judaism or the Muslim religion, only big figures in history claim to have that kind of link. And in that sense, you have to conclude that sometimes when it reaches that level of narcissism, then you are talking not only about a political religion, but almost a sect, a political sect. And I see a lot of elements of that in Bolsonaro's way of doing politics. And of course, that is extremely dangerous to democracy, to the extent that you can convince, as Brazilians, representing, by the way, the majority, you can convince people of of these deeply held Christian beliefs that this is, in a way, not really what religion is about. Religion is about the privacy of the spiritual sphere rather than imposing totalitarian ideas onto everyone in the field of politics. So what you see here is an appropriation of Christianity, which of course happened before in the cases of fascism in countries like Argentina, but also in Spain, to some extent in Brazil, and also in Italy and many other places. You have people behaving as if they own the word of God. And that's why we call these experts, we call this, in the history of fascism, we call this clerical fascism. And there are many elements of clerical fascism in Bolsonarismo, I think. Now, let me go back to something that I think it's important to remember here, is that fascists and populists often claim to be talking for the majority, but in fact, that is not a fact. Not even in the last election, Bolsonaro got a kind of absolute majority. He received the most votes. And it's important to remember this, because this idea that he presented, that the colors of the flag are identified with bolsonarismo, or that Brazil, as he said, belongs to us, is not empirically true, and that should be also remembered, I think. That even if these people that believe in this sect of bolsonarismo cannot be convinced, they are not the majority. And that's why I think it's important to think about this in anti-fascist terms, in terms of an anti-fascist coalition.
And you have mentioned as well the approval polls of Bolsonaro that are facing a huge slump. And my question is, do you think that this wave is receding, as it were? Because it came so quickly, and it seems to be going away so quickly as well, with the defeat of Trump, his isolation, the eventual defeat of Bolsonaro. And if he doesn't do anything crazy, he's just going to end up like Trump. So do you see it receding quickly?
Well, again, like as an historian, I'm an expert on the past. I don't know exactly what will happen. We historians, we are bad in predicting the future. But I can tell you some precedents. I mean, we already see with Trump that actually he has not disappeared, but actually he remains very powerful within the opposition. So, I mean, like, I don't think it goes away, even if they lose. I mean, and as the example of Trump shows, I mean, he tried a coup d'etat, which was not supported. And we heard a couple of days ago, by the way, that some generals were very worried about this kind of Nazi, I mean, and that's how they frame it, kind of Reichstag, fire situation by Trump. But then I asked myself, even in the case of the US, what kind of democracy do we have? A democracy that depends on the benevolence of the military. And that's why I'm also concerned about Brazil in that situation. Because, I mean, in order for fascism to be defeated, you not only need, majorities opposing it, but also you need the civil services and the armed forces to be faithful to the Constitution, not to the narcissistic, prophet-like leader. And it's important then to do this kind of, I think, to make this very clear. I mean, to all these employees of the state, that the majorities are not with the prophet or the wannabe fascist dictator, and they need to stand with the Constitution. So, I mean, it's an ongoing work, and one cannot assume that everything is for granted. Now, for these kind of, even people that are enablers of this kind of authoritarian attempts, I think a strong message is like big difference in votes. And I think why the elections are so important, and I actually think that is one of the reasons why Bolsonaro is so scared about the elections, because we see a Bolsonaro that is very afraid, I mean, of losing, and these kind of people are really bad losers. I mean,
you have said as well about the fascist relationship with violence, which is, of course, quite central to it. I have a bit of an outside question. With all this talk of strong men and the strong society, do you think fascism is an ideology that's contaminated by maleness? I mean, by the optimization of the male character, as it were. What's your take on this?
Well, definitely. I mean, your point is really well taken. There is a sense, I mean, there is a particular, masculinity, a particular form of maleness. It's not maleness or masculinity, but a particular kind of chauvinistic, machista kind of masculinity. I mean, which identifies masculinity with a particularly repressive order of gender relations, right? A very violent man who is also very muscular, and he has particular features, right? And you see this in fascist propaganda. Not necessarily in reality, because not necessarily these fascist bodies look like the image that they want to project. But there is, yes, a very toxic masculinity element here, which of course doesn't define masculinity as such. It's a particularly repressive form of masculinity, by the way, a very traditional one, very, I would say, very discriminatory one, insofar as it presents one type of masculinity and one type of sexuality vis-a-vis other types of masculinity or other types of sexuality that it regards as being abnormal. So, and again, this is very old. This is a very, it precedes fascism, and it has been studied by one of the greatest historians of fascism, which is the historian George Mossey, who wrote this fantastic book on the creation of modern masculinity. Because if we go back in history, of course, masculinity was much more pluralistic than the repressive order that started, I think, in the 19th century and got like a kind of really full speed, or it was even more radicalized in its repressive nature via fascism. So you see in Bolsonaro many elements of this as well, or in Trump.
Of course. Well, thank you, Professor.
Se você gostou dessa entrevista, registre seu like e compartilhe o vídeo. Seja também um membro do canal ou agradeça como contribuição. Muito obrigado e até a próxima.